Hello all, my name is Ankush Agnihotri. Today we will continue our Angular journey. This is part 6 of it. If you haven't watched the other part, I suggest you to watch that first. Link is in description, and also please subscribe the channel to get the latest notification on this series. So let's start. Today we will talk about the Angular data bindings. Data binding is a technique where the data stays in sync between the component and the view. When the user updates the data in the view, Angular get the updated component, and when the component get the new data, vice versa, Angular update the view. So in Angular, the data binding is broadly classified into the two groups. One is one-way binding and other is two-way binding. In one-way binding, the data flows only in the single direction, either from the component to the view or from view to the component. If we talk about the component to the view, it is classified into the two categories. One is the interpolation and second is the property binding, which is further divided into the three categories: class binding, style binding and the attribute binding. And on the other side, when we talk about the view to the component, it is classified by the event binding. So let's start by interpolation. What is interpolation? Interpolation basically allows us to include the expression as the part of the any string literal which we use in our HTML. Angular uses the double curly braces in the template to denote the interpolation. The syntax we will show in our slide. Curly braces inside the template expression. The Angular first evaluates this template expression and convert it into the simple string. Then it replaces the template expression with the original string in the HTML. We will see this practical example in a bit. Let's move forward to the property binding. Property binding allows us to bind the HTML property to a property in the component. When the value of the component changes, the Angular updates the element property in the view. We can also set the HTML property like href, src, text content of the any HTML input or any HTML element, you can say. The syntax for the property binding is basically the binding target of the element and then is the binding source. Basically source is the property that we define in our component. So let's talk about the class binding. We can set the class binding in the three ways. First way, class name property binding, and then set the class attribute with the class binding, and then the ng class directives. These are the different three ways by which we can define our class name. Next is the style binding. We can also set the styles by using the style attribute of the HTML element directly, or we can also use the ng style directives. Third is the attribute binding. The attribute binding, it starts with the syntax of the attr. Basically attrr denotes the attribute of any HTML elements. Below is the example we will show in the red box, basically in which we are using the array attributes that are used for the dumb and the deaf peoples, and you can see we are using the attr attribute of the button element. Let's switch to the code to perform this code. So in the last session we learned how to create a component. Now in this component we will learn the other basics of the Angular. So let's open our HTML and the component file, and also one more, the style file. Now close our this one. Okay, and also we need one more component file. So let's close this, switch into the two windows. In one window open the HTML, in another window we will open the TypeScript file so that we can save our time. So for save our timing, I have HTML code ready for the demo. Let's place that first. So firstly we discuss about the interpolation in Angular. So basically any expression defined between the curly braces is known as the template expression, and the using of these template expression is known as the interpolation. If we run our app in this, firstly what we are trying to achieve is we are trying to define a property with the name as interpolation in the TypeScript file, and here I am defining its value, string value, and then I am calling a function using the interpolation in which I am getting the current date and time in my view. So let's start npm start. This will compile our code and run the application on the port 4200. So it's hosting now. Let's run the app. So you will see it is running fine up. So now we will see why our checks are not updated. So we save both the files. Now you can see, if I zoom the browser, you will see the title and first interpolation property. Then you are able to see the date time by using the interpolation function that you have defined in your TypeScript file welcome.component.ts file. So this is the basic example how we can use interpolation in Angular. Fine. Now moving towards the next demo, which is property binding in Angular. So let's copy the HTML for the same. In this, what we are doing is basically we are trying to define the property of the HTML element using the property binding, and here I am using the inner text property of the paragraph element, and the property that I am using is the property binding element, and here I am using a flag which will enable or disable our button. So since it is throwing me error, why it is throwing error? Because I have to define this property in my TypeScript file, or basically you can say a component file. So here I have just copy pasted the two properties that I am using. Now if we see the output on the browser, save both the files, it will get compiled successfully, and now you will see the output. Here you have a property binding and here you have a button. So you will see the output is directly managed from the TypeScript file. If I change here in the property and save the file, you will see it will automatically updated on your view, and same for the button, right? Now moving towards the next demo, which is class binding with the class name in Angular. So just copy the HTML for the same, then we will discuss. So in this, what we are doing, just minimize it. Yeah, so here firstly what we are doing is I am using the attribute class name, and then I am passing a class name. This class name is defined in our welcome.component.css file. So I am using a 3 class for the demo: red, green, and the larger font class. Okay, so we can define all our component related styles in the welcome.component.css file. So now here, if I just remove this, this is the class name example. So it's compiled successfully. Now we see on the browser, you will able to see the output class binding with the class name, the value that we have given over there, and we are using the red class. So the output you are shown in the browser, it is in red color. So if I just change the color, or you can say a class, to green and hit save, see the output is in green. So it is dynamically changes based upon the class that you are giving. Okay, moving toward the next demo, here we can also drive it with the attribute, like basically conditionally applying the class. You have one method in your TypeScript file, that is in our case the has error. Okay, so if we carefully look on this has error method, we need to be define it on the TypeScript so that we can decide whether we want to be show that particular class logically or not. So simply define that method in your TypeScript file over here. You can say over here. The method is simply returning a false. Based upon your condition, you can manage this flag. So if we simply save both the files, now here if we have a error, I am using a red color. If I don't have a error, I am using a green color. If we saw the output on this, you will see the conditional class binding with the class name example over here. So this is the conditionally using the class name bindings, how we can use it, the conditional operator in the method to define our classes. Okay, so next is the class binding using the ng built-in ng directive of the Angular. So what we need to be do is we will simply use the square bracket ng class, then we will pass our classes, multiple classes, by just adding a simple space and with a single quote. Here you can see I am using a two classes, red and the larger font. In the next line what I am using, I am passing a array of classes. In this way we will simply pass as many as classes, output will be the same on the browser. Next is we can also use the object of the classes. Here is another example of it. I have simply created an object, and here I am just enabling or disabling the class names, right? So if I just hit save, it's compiled. Now we will see the output. You will see here with array, with object and with the ng class bindings. Fine. So moving towards the next demo, that is the style binding. So in this style binding we will use the style attributes of the HTML element. Here the example of it, using square bracket style.background class I am trying to access, and I am giving a gray color to it. And if I have to give the multiple property, then I will do using the ng style in Angular, ng style color property, then font size, and then the font weight of it. And if we see the output now in our browser, you will see this gray background. This is the first example of the style binding, and then the multiple style, which is the example of the ng style in Angular. Fine. Now let's moving towards the next demo, which is attribute binding. So just copy the HTML, required HTML, and the property for this. So here I have defined the property, simple string property. Here you can see this is the attribute type binding. We also used that before in the previous example when we are trying to do the property binding of it. This is also known as the attribute binding. If I simply save this, both the files, and see the proper output on the browser window, you will see the attribute binding example. Fine. So this is the one-way binding in Angular. So if we moving forward to the two-way bindings, this is the firstly component to view binding. Now if we move towards the next view to component binding, then we have a event binding for it. Basically for the event binding allows us to bind the events such as the keystroke, click, hover event, touch event of the button, so that we can pass that event from our component to the view. Here is the example of it. Firstly we will define the target event of the HTML element, then we will pass our template statement that we want to be passed. For example, if we have a button, then we will define its click event. So let's see how we can define that. Moving to the VS Code, let's take the required HTML for this. Now in this HTML what I am doing is I have a one button that is named clicked me, and for this I need one method, and below that by using the interpolation I am basically showing the click count of my button. So let's define this function and the property in the TypeScript file. Save it. Initially the type click count is of number type whose value is 0, and this click me function, what it is doing, it's simply incrementing the count the moment I am start clicking the button. So save both the files, open the browser, scroll down. Here we have a event binding. If I start clicking the button, see the count is updating on the view. So this is the event binding example how we can pass a click event in Angular. So now moving forward, now we have a two-way binding, in which two-way binding means changes made to our model in the component are propagated to the view as well as to the component. Both the properties are in sync. How we can achieve this? We can achieve this by using the ng model. So basically two-way binding help us to check or keep in track the properties that we want to be track as soon as the user change the value of it. So let's take an example. You have a text box, you want to be track its value. So by using the two-way binding we can track it. Since ng model directive is not part of the Angular core library, what we need to do, we need to import the Angular form library from the Angular forms. So let's copy the required HTML for this demo. So in this what we are doing is, I have a one input type text box and I am binding this using the ng model. Okay, and then I have one property model value for which I am tracking it and I am displaying it on my browser, and on click on the button of clear, when I have defined one function named as clear value, which will clear the value of this property value. So let's copy this property and the function. So here I have one property named as model value, which is of string type and whose value is empty initially, and then I have a method clear value. In this what I am doing is I am just clearing this value. Now on the view side I have this ng model attribute. This input is now bind to this model value property. And one more thing we need to be make sure for this demo to work, on the app module you need to be import this form module, because the ng model belongs to this library Angular forms. If you haven't imported that, it will start giving you a compilation error. Okay, so let's scroll it down. Now we have a text box. I will start typing my name, Ankush Agnihotri. You will see it will be reflecting your value for the paragraph also. When I click on this, it will clear the value too. So this is the example of the two-way binding. So let's move forward to perform the code. So that's it for the today. In this lecture we will learn about the data binding in Angular with the different kind of events and property and the class attributes. Thanks for watching. See you in the next lecture.